Illustrious. I am Vincent Freeman, joined alongside by my good friend Bruce. Bruce, how are you doing today?
Good as usual, my friend.
We are joined by the illustrious Angel Eduardo. He is a writer, a musician, pretty much a jack of all trades, really. He's one of our favorite people that we've interviewed in the past. And congratulations also, he's currently working, writing for Fire. He's the senior writer and editor over there. So, Mr. Eduardo, thank you so much for coming here and chatting with us.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here again.
Absolutely.
Angel, you and I have corresponded quite a bit on Twitter and then some
hmm
ever since the last time you spoke on our podcast. And what really prompted us to get you back on here was the number of bullets that Sam Harris had taken recently because of stating his views
Mm.
on handling a variety of topics, just noticeably like the how the issue of Donald Trump should be handled, and especially how COVID-19 was how policy conducting COVID-19 was handled on a public platform like Twitter.
hmm
Uh, One of the books you recommended to everyone on social media was Amusing Yourself to Death by Neil Postman. That's a book I read through, and as you said, it provided some very, very interesting perspectives. What I've been doing also in the meantime is reading Jacob McChangama's book on free speech in parallel.
Nice.
And I've been walking away with a lot of perspective as the ideas behind how free expression evolved because of all these historical precedents we've been through.
hmm
Two figures I want to ask you about. One of them was Erasmus of Rotterdam, and of course Neil Postman, and they both, in one way or another, made the argument that, in Erasmus's case, the printing press, and Neil Postman, the television, they contribute more to dumbing down society because you get to throw out a lot of nonsensical opinions out there, and you can share them broadly, et cetera, et cetera.
hmm
Um, in my personal opinion, I think Erasmus's case was invalid because the printing press actually proved to be a real source of intellectual technology. Being able to carry information with you from place to place was essential to how people think.
hmm
Neil Postman has more substance to it because the television allowed people to silo themselves away. But fast forward to the 21st century when you have a social media platform like Twitter being the prime example. There's also Facebook, and I don't know how Instagram works in that regard, but you have a technology that's algorithmically designed to silo people away to show you bits and pieces of news that are relevant to your interests, and therefore you don't get to see a whole lot of other perspectives. Um, with the argument given to these other intellectual technologies, do you think Twitter is a fully realized avatar of the criticisms that Neil Postman and Erasmus brought to the table in terms of the use of certain intellectual technologies?
Hmm. Well, I'm not really familiar with Erasmus, but I can say that there's this great meme of it's a photograph of a bunch of people on a train car in a train car. And it's a black and white photo, and the caption says something like cell phones are terrible. They disconnect us from each other. Like nobody really looks at each other or talks to each other anymore. And then the black and white photograph is all these people buried in newspapers, like every single one of them. There's not a single person talking to anybody next to them. They're all just reading the paper on the train, which I think is it illustrates um, it illustrates the issue. I think, which is that there have always been these sorts of technological dangers, if you want to call them, or or there have always been sort of dangers to these technological bits of progress, right? The printing press, yes, definitely had some negative effects, right? Uh, people could now disseminate their ideas, their terrible ideas, at a larger scale than they could before, right? People would probably argue, before the village idiot would just be the village idiot, and his reach was basically anybody who walked past him, right? But now the village idiot can write a book, and that book can travel all of the continent of Europe, and the idiocy just spreads that way. I think it's just the same thing, and the answer continues to be, you know, it's a conservative talking point at this point, but it's personal responsibility. As these things come up, as these technologies allow us to have a wider reach, there's going to come a bunch of there are going to be a bunch of consequences to that we're going to have to grapple with, and that just means we're going to have to grow up, and we're going to have to get responsible. We're just gonna have to deal with these things. It's the same as, when you turn 16 or 17, 18, whatever, you start driving a car, there's a responsibility that comes along with that. There are dangers that come along with that. And then there are privileges that come along with that and benefits that come along with that. And you have to be able to balance both so that you can get the good out of it. I see the same thing with social media. I see, I've written about this where Twitter is really what you make it. Yes, there are algorithms and, we should pay attention to that stuff, but uh, it's also kind of, if you go on YouTube and you search puppy videos and you just search puppy videos, puppy videos, puppy videos for a couple of days, then the next day when you log in, all your feed is going to be is puppy videos, right? The algorithm is going to feed you what you want. And so the real question you have to ask yourself is, why do you want the kind of stuff that you're getting? And how can you change that? Right? If everyone is blaming the platform, but the platform is just trying to get your attention, what gets your attention is up to you. You know, I don't know if that really answers your question, but it's a complicated thing.
It gives me some perspective in that regard because I think that one of the things that gets thrown around a lot is that we live in a post-truth society. But like, how much does truth matter to you in the first place? And like, I think
Mm-hmm.
as your mutual friend Peter Boghossian puts it, it's like you have to develop an attitude of I don't know his exact words. You have to develop an attitude that's conducive towards looking for truth, and often that means dealing with different perspectives. So if
Mm-hmm.
we're using that technology in, if we're really true to that philosophy, then it behooves us to use that technology in a fashion where we make the effort to search out alternative viewpoints, and then that algorithm can actually work in somewhat in our favor. I think that's what you're trying to say, and that's what it means by growing up in terms of this technology,
Yeah,
growing up.
we have to learn how to meet the expectations here because I've used the metaphor of a chainsaw, right? Social media is like a chainsaw. You could do a lot of cool, wonderful, productive things with a chainsaw, but you can also hack your leg off if you don't know what you're doing. And that's why you wouldn't hand a 10-year-old a chainsaw because you're not ready. You can't handle this thing yet, right? So maybe culturally, societally, we're still 10 years old, but we've been handed a chainsaw. And so we're going to have to, sit down for a minute, put our goggles on, figure out how this works, and then use it deliberately and consciously. Otherwise, we're going to get hurt. And I think that's kind of what's happening right now.
Yeah, I your perspective on this is it's completely correct. I've I've often thought about how what it is that we see in society and the things that we criticize, really at the end of the day, they're ultimately a reflection of our own desires of what it is that we want. As many people complain about CNN and MSNBC for spoon feeding all these really biased and inaccurate stories, at the end of the day, they exist because of us, because that's what we wanted. All they did was try to calculate what the audience wanted and what was likely to grab our attention, and they capitalized on that. And even taking, into consideration the sort of things that are more at the subconscious level, the like button on Facebook, for instance, that subconsciously gets you to want to come back. At the end of the day, as you said, it ultimately is just us making these decisions. And what Twitter is, I really like what you said here. What Twitter is effectively what we make out of it. The reason why Twitter is, or why it can be so toxic and so ill conducive for conversation, well, that's precisely because we made it that way. And I think the only way that we can kind of navigate around that problem is just hopefully try to change the culture. One that appreciates these sorts of conversations more, one that is more open and willing to have these conversations. And I often wonder how we didn't evolve to be able to talk to everybody on the planet, to be able to convey our opinions. It's a very recent thing. And we're having some growing pains in terms of this technology. But I think at the end of the day, looking at the bigger picture, there are so many wonderful things that can come from a website like Twitter, that can come from the internet in general. And we just have to make sure that we're responsible about it, that our maturity is on par with the technology that we have, and be able to navigate it effectively. And I think this is something that you've done really well in you had a podcast with the lovely Melissa Chen not too long ago for Fair, and that was one of the main things that you guys really stressed in that podcast, especially in the one with Daryl Davis, where you talked about being able to have these difficult conversations. And so, my question to you is, how is it that you try to navigate these conversations? And given the landscape of Twitter and how, for one, the format is an issue as well because it's just tweets with, I forgot how many characters are now, but how do you try to navigate these conversations there at this point?
Well, I think first of all, it's important to note that none of this lets the platforms themselves off the hook, right? There are still things, like Tristan Harris and all the work that he's doing with all his colleagues about, you know, highlighting the ways that these platforms are hijacking your attention and sort of prodding your basest instincts and things like that. All that stuff matters, and it's really important to do that work. So I'm not discounting it, and I'm not saying it shouldn't be done, and I'm not saying that the platforms themselves don't have some responsibility here as well. They definitely do. There should be, reasonable, insane terms of service. There should be reasonable, insane, and consistent moderation, right? Because it's up to them to sort of build the parameters that people work in. But at the end of the day, it really boils down to who you are, what you're doing, and how you're doing it, and that's going to determine what you get out of this thing. So from my vantage point, I mean, the limitations of the 280 characters or whatever it is, I kind of see it as a writing exercise. I'm a writer, so I love it. Helps me be a better writer in some ways, right? I learn to be even more concise and just keep things at tweet length. Some things can't be tweet length, and my rule for myself is if it's more than 4 or 5 tweets, then it's an essay, and I should be getting paid to write it, right? So, I kind of created that for myself. But besides that, it's really just it's it's about the principles that you bring to the table, right? People say all the time that Twitter makes them a worse version of themselves, that it makes them angry and hostile. It doesn't really make you anything, right? It allows you to be whatever. It allows you to be those things. Maybe it enables you to be those things, right? So there's a little bit of a nudge there. But at the end of the day, it's up to you. You're the one who's typing that horrible thing and then hitting send. That's you. You're deciding to do that. And it's important to recognize that because then you can change that. And what I do is, there's just a certain way that I'm committed to engaging. And it's difficult. It's not something that comes super easily. It's not something that I don't fail at. I fail at all the time. But I'm just committed to engaging in a particular way. And that is regardless of how people engage with me, right? So if somebody's hostile to me, I don't change my rule of not being hostile, right? I'll just flag the hostility and decide for myself at that moment, do I want to continue this? Is there some way that I can maybe get around this, or should I just abandon this conversation? Because what I'm not going to do is meet that hostility with my own hostility and then just get sucked into that whole thing. I just don't want to. And so, you can train yourself to start to see that. And it's the other funny thing is just that people say, I'm a worse version of myself on Twitter. And there are reasons why that makes sense. There's the anonymity, there's the detachment, and all that kind of stuff. But I'm actually a better version of myself on Twitter because that detachment gives me a little bit of a buffer, right? Like there's a moment where I can pause before I hit send and decide, do I really want to say this? Do I really want to waste my time doing this right now? Whereas if you're talking to a person, face to face and you're getting heated, it's really hard to pause yourself in that moment, and not say the thing because it's so much more automated. It's so much more like, the words are just starting to come out. Your emotions just take over and the words just come out. And, I can put my phone down and walk away and do something else. That's the nature of the paradigm, right? Like there's no expectation that I must respond within 30 seconds. But when you're having a conversation with somebody face to face, you can't really just get up and leave, right? You have to say something at least, so it's more difficult. So it's interesting that people find it harder on Twitter because I find it easier in many ways.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to put your foot in your mouth if you're having an in-person conversation.
Yeah,
And
right.
yeah, and you can't really block or mute people on Twitter. Um, but
Yeah,
there is,
right.
yeah, as you said though, there is that concern of uh, I guess putting a veil between you and the person because you can't see them face to face and you don't see their facial reactions. It is harder
Hmm.
to empathize for that reason. But as you said, and I've never thought about that before, where doing it online on Twitter actually does give you some sort of moment of self reflection. And it gives you time to think about the type of person that you want to portray, that you want to convey yourself as. And that is
Right.
certainly a benefit of Twitter there. And as you
Hmm.
said, Twitter does have its fair share of issues when it comes to how it is that how toxic I guess the space can be, right? I think this is
Hmm.
equation with multiple variables, and while one of the variables is how we
Yeah.
ultimately decide to behave ourselves, one of them is certainly how Twitter decides to I guess, manipulate its audiences in terms of isolating people into their own echo chambers and only um, propagating certain stories. There was the big one that was hugely controversial from the New York Post about Hunter Biden's laptop. That's certainly a topic of conversation there. So Twitter, by no stretch of the imagination, is innocent. And I can't think of a single platform that would be innocent. But that does open up the conversation of, well, what should Twitter be allowed to do in terms of who they allow on their platform and who they don't allow on their platform? I think this is one of the biggest debates surrounding the website, given how many people that they have deplatformed. And what I've thought about is there are things that Twitter, there are things that we could probably legally justify and things that we should probably expect. So I think legally speaking, and I could be wrong about this, I'm more than happy to change my mind. I think legally speaking, it makes more sense than not for Twitter to be able to decide who gets to be on their platform and who doesn't get to be on their platform. I think, yeah, and I think that the government or believing that the government should be able to impose that amount of power is really concerning because even if Twitter becomes a bastion of left wing politics, I think for one, I mean that's better than the the I I think a lot of other platforms, and this is going to make me sound like a libertarian, but I'm not a libertarian. I think that even if Twitter does become a bastion of left wing politics and everyone gravitates towards Twitter because of that and it becomes toxic for that reason, I think other companies should be allowed to make their own product and try to make it better and one that is a better reflection of what human beings want. Now, and I think the issue that a lot of people bring up with whether or not Twitter is the public square, I think that's more of an issue of the fact that Twitter effectively has a monopolization in this industry. And this is an issue that we've been having in the United States when it comes with places like Walmart, where they've pretty much run out many small businesses. But I don't think it's an issue in terms of whether or not Twitter should be allowed to do this legally. And I would argue that all the alternatives that have come about have not been better than Twitter. Gab was basically all the other alternatives were right wing cesspools. If anything, they were worse than Twitter. And so I think that no matter what, even with those far right wing apps that come about, at the end of the day, there's still going to be some level of moderation. No matter what, these corporations are going to say, okay, we probably shouldn't allow doxing on our website. We probably shouldn't allow people to use racial slurs towards other people in a demeaning way. No matter what, there always is going to be some level of moderation. And if there isn't, well, we get 4chan, as Sam Harris said. And even though Twitter's main problem is with moderating viewpoints and or seemingly benign things, right? Like banning people who are gender critical, I think at the end of the day, if there does have to be some level of content moderation, I'm more comfortable with Twitter being able to decide that what is going to be on their platform rather than the government. And that's coming from someone who is not a libertarian by any stretch of the imagination. But I just think for all the issues that come from that, and there are many issues, I think it's better than the alternative. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've written about this, and there are probably a couple of points where maybe depending on what he means, I disagree with Sam Harris about this stuff, which is kind of new because I generally agree with Sam Harris all the time. um, but here there are a couple of things where it really just depends on what he means. I'm not totally clear on what he means with some of this, but generally speaking, I do think he's right in terms of, he shouldn't be compelled to have people on his podcast, for example, that he doesn't want, right? And the argument can't be, well, you have an extremely popular podcast, millions and millions of people watch it, so now you have a duty to have this person on or this person on, or you have a duty to not have this person on or that person on, because you've sort of transcended this sort of private platform thing, given your level of exposure and given your level of audience. Like that would be destabilizing to a whole number of things, right? And I think it's the same thing with Twitter, right? It's, I've written about it being the public square, and how that's just a mistaken idea. It is not the public square. We're calling it that. Some of us are calling it that and trying to act like it, but it's not that in very fundamental and important ways. And if we wanted to make it that, it would change in very important and fundamental ways, and important and fundamental ways that we probably wouldn't like you were just mentioning. Now we'd have to, if it's a public square like a public park is, right? Think about how a public park works. You can go there, you can do what you like, you can play ball, you can have a picnic, you can have a little birthday party if you want, right? You can do all these things. It's generally kind of lax and laissez-faire, and everybody's just kind of doing their thing. But if you want to hold like a political rally, you have to get permits now. You have to, talk to some people. You have to go through some paperwork. You have to do all this stuff. If you want to hold a concert there, that's a whole other thing you have to do, right? What if there's a fight? What if two people literally start beating the crap out of each other at this park? The cops show up. Someone calls the cops because they're the ones who are now the authority that have to show up. And if you want to turn Twitter into the digital version of that, there are so many complicated questions and considerations, right? Like, if there's a fight, who's going to arbitrate the fight? Because the one person might be in the United States and the other person might be in China or India, and the rules are different. So whose rules are going to, going to be present here? Like, are we figuring out some brand new rules? Are we turning Twitter into a new country that has its own sort of, and then who figures out the rule? Like, it's complicated. I'm not saying there are no answers to these questions, but they're definitely difficult. And I don't think that anybody who is claiming that Twitter is the public square or should be the public square so far has grappled with any of these questions. It's a really difficult thing to think about and do. And it seems to me much more simple to just say, listen, it's a private platform and they can do whatever they like. We can complain about it. And if they want, they can listen to our complaints, but they don't have to. And if we really don't like it, we can leave and we can go somewhere else. And yeah, I know that the alternatives are not great, but that's really still also up to us, right? If we really wanted to make a great alternative, we could. As for Twitter being a monopoly, I don't think it really is, right? It's not stopping anybody from creating their own social media platform. It's just that it's the most popular one. It's the one that is the most prominent, where all the people are, and as a result, that's where all the action is. Um, but that can change tomorrow. There's nothing really stopping anything from making that happen if that's what people wanted, right? It's where people want to be, and so that's where they are. So it's a little bit different.
Yeah, I really like the this is why I was saying how legally Twitter should be allowed to uh ban whomever they would like and make the rules on their own website. But as you said, we have the we should also be able to complain about it. So I think that culturally speaking, I think the cultural norm should be to look down upon what it is that Twitter is doing when they ban people that are pretty benign. I think culturally we shouldn't tolerate that, but legally I can't imagine it would be very wise to force them to keep these people on. And I agree with you that the alternatives aren't any good. And I would argue that, and I could be wrong about the monopoly issue. I would say that just because of the advertisement clouds and because of just the meme of Twitter itself, no one is really going to know about any other alternatives. At least the people who aren't on, the political landscape like we are. But, and I would say that any of the alternatives that have come up, none of them really have stressed that the main focus that they're going to do is simply not ban people like Abigail Schreier. She's still on Twitter, but people who have similar views to her have been banned. and instead just kind of allow everything there. I think no one, for one, it's really hard to market that, but two, it's just yeah. So I think a version of Twitter that I think would be much better, and really the one that I kind of advocate for when I do criticize Twitter, is just one in which you don't ban people for holding genuine beliefs and opinions that they are arguing on intellectual grounds. There's a huge difference between someone who is a bit of a troll and who kind of responds with offensive and disparaging comments. There's a difference between someone like that. Let's say they're racist. There's a difference between that and a genuine intellectual who might hold views that are conducive that a racist is likely to also hold. But if they're arguing for them on what they believe are legitimate grounds, let's say Charles Murray would be a good example. If they genuinely believe in what they're saying and they're using the proper means or what they perceive to be the proper means of scientific inquiry, I don't think we should ban them. I think everyone should be allowed to say what they genuinely believe. And if they're saying it within, if they're being civil about it and they're trying to openly engage with the opposition, I think we shouldn't ban those people. So we shouldn't be banning gender critical people either.
Yeah, I generally agree with that. I think that's about right. I think that yeah, the real conversation, the real difficulty is a cultural one, not a legal one. I think the legal stuff seems to be fairly set and it seems to make sense. But morally and culturally, yeah, there's part of the problem with Twitter before was how inconsistently the terms of service were applied. There's literal like jihadists who are still on there, calling for people's heads and things. And then there's somebody who says, men aren't women and gets banned for life or whatever. Like that's obviously something's wrong here in the application of things. And also there was the blue check sort of controversy where uh, certain people were getting blue checks and other people weren't, even though they applied for them and totally met all the criteria and had millions of followers and things. And it seemed to be very ideological. There was a kind of black box around that. And that's something, yeah, that's something that makes sense to flag and say, hey, obviously something is not being done fairly here, right? But, as I'm sure you've noticed, Elon Musk took over Twitter and quickly discovered how difficult it actually is to do some of this stuff, right? It's not easy. It's simple in theory to say, yeah, as long as you're not hateful, as long as you're not, directly antagonizing somebody in, to a certain degree, as long as you're not doing XYZ, you should be allowed to just engage, and it should be a platform that's free of, that kind of stuff, but otherwise, go for it. It's easy to say that, but it's harder to put it into practice because you're talking about millions and millions and millions of interactions. And you're going to have to employ algorithms and AI and all these things to help you. Otherwise, everyone would work for Twitter and everyone would just be monitoring everyone else's Twitter. It would just be impossible because of the number of interactions that would need to be monitored and stuff. So it just becomes really, really hard to actually do this. So even people with the best intentions, even people who are committed to actually fairly and consistently applying these terms of service, they still have a hell of a lot of work to do, and they're still going to make a ton of mistakes because it's just really hard. Where's the line between when something is contentious and suddenly becomes incredibly hostile and dangerous? Where's the line? Who gets to decide where the line is? It's just impossible. So I think in that sense, we all kind of have to understand that this stuff is never going to be perfect. But we also definitely do need moderation because, as you mentioned, there are places with no moderation or very little moderation, and nobody really wants to go there, because it's a disaster. Nobody really wants to be in the middle of all that. So, yeah, I guess it's just important to recognize how difficult this actually is. So people, again, who are like kind of, clamoring for the thing they see in their head, I think maybe haven't thought through what it's like in practice, how difficult it actually is to make that.
That's what drove me nuts right after the November explosion when Sam just got raked over the coals for his views. Now, even I had trouble as a long. He's been a huge influence on me over the last 10 years. So even I had trouble with what with some of what he said. But like as you said, Angel, like soon afterwards, when Elon was getting more active, he found out that, hey, well, this stuff isn't as easy as I thought it would be. There are a lot of
Yeah.
gotcha scenarios and a lot of variables that I don't think he or anyone else had considered.
Hmm.
So, even a few weeks afterwards, I think more and more people were starting to debate what should and shouldn't happen on there. So it really told me that, like, most of us, myself included, have not thought this through clearly. Now, we obviously want free expression to
Hmm.
be the north star of what we want to accomplish, but how do we get accomplish that in terms of moderation, in terms of allowing public private companies to
Right.
maintain their private sphere?
Yeah. Yeah.
But one argument that's been of interest to me ever since I heard it. It ties back to the Second Amendment. Like, back then when there was a right to bear arms. Back then everyone was bearing muskets, but nowadays you have more advanced rifles,
Right.
more advanced weaponry that perhaps the average citizen should not have. What use would you have for them in those times? And
Right.
there's an argument that you can stay true to the overall spirit of the amendment, but come on, this is not the 18th century. This is the 21st century now. And, like,
Hmm.
technology has changed the dynamics of what it means to bear a weapon. Um, I see something analogous happening with the First Amendment, and
Mm.
like I said before, that free expression should be our north star. It's our core value that allows us to
Hmm.
evolve in terms of how we view ethics. But
Hmm.
this is not the printing press. This is not the television. This is a technology with 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 unforeseen consequences in the 21st century. So, do we, as a matter of fact, need to update our understanding of what the specifics of free
Yeah.
expression are, while staying true to the general principle? I'm not advocating for cancel culture. I'm not advocating for, like, going out there
Of
and just
course.
spreading poison. But, like, the dynamics have changed to some extent. I think that part, there is
Yeah.
some validity in that view.
Um, I think there are definitely good reasons to be concerned about that sort of stuff, and I think it ends up being a kind of you have freedom of speech but not freedom of reach type thing. And so that's kind of where people get into it, I think, where they say, you don't have a constitutional right to a Twitter account. You don't, there's no guarantee that you should have that. And I think that's right. You can make up your own, I guess, and you can whatever. But yeah, I mean, I just think it's probably untenable to try to figure out some way to correct the issue that you're pointing to in terms of the amendments and the law and that sort of stuff. It's going to have to be a cultural thing, the same as it was with the printing press, right? Where people should just publish whatever they want to publish, and then it becomes sort of our responsibility as individuals, and then sort of as concentric circles of culture and society to regulate that in pro-social ways where we teach people to think critically and to want to find opposing viewpoints and to use the scientific method and have ways of confirming the things that they're reading rather than just taking it at face value. And I think the printing press was just as huge and revolutionary. It's hard for us to contextualize it because it's been supplanted by social media, but in many ways it really is the same principle is at play. It's just on a grander scale now, but it's also been 200 plus years, and we have to figure out what are we going to do with this new version of things. The principles still remain, and we just have to find the best ways to approach those principles given the context we're in, which is a more complicated context. I'll definitely grant that. But I don't know that the answer is, and not necessarily that this is what you're saying, but I don't know that the answer is sort of saying, oh, well, we have discovered the limits to free expression. We're going to have to cut it off right here. Because, who decides that? How do they decide it? And what happens when we realize that that was probably not sufficient or a totally bad move? I don't know. I don't know. So it seems to me that it always comes back to, look, we're going to have to learn to talk to each other. We're going to have to learn to both recognize the level of responsibility that we're being tasked with here. You know, it's Spider-Man, it's Uncle Ben over and over again. It's we keep getting these great powers, we're gonna have to get the great responsibility that comes with it. We can't ignore it. We can't shirk it. We're just gonna have to deal with that. And so the sooner we start talking about that part of it, the better. So far, we're having a lot of trouble talking about that part.
Yeah, I think one of the things that just does, I guess, bring me some level of happiness is knowing that Twitter is not real life and that most people's viewpoints are not reflected based on what you see on Twitter. One of the things that I have debated myself on, and this was when it originally happened, was when Twitter decided to take down Donald Trump's account. And it's one of those things where, of course, legally, I think Twitter should be allowed to do that. Whether or not they should have, I sympathize with the arguments. I'm not a fan of Donald Trump by any stretch of the imagination. I sympathize with the argument that Donald Trump can be viewed in some analogous fashion to Alex Jones, someone who propagates, even before he became president, the birther conspiracy. Someone who is a genuinely concerning and conspiratorial figure. And I'd like to thank Michael Shermer for illuminating on how conspiracies work, given his most recent book that he published. And I can sympathize with that argument. And if he did break the rules, the genuine terms that Twitter has when you sign up, I can recognize that Twitter is in full accordance with their own terms of service that Donald Trump should be let go. However, I think the fact remains that the difference between Alex Jones and Donald Trump is that Donald Trump was the president of the United States, and there are so many consequences that come from deplatforming such a figure. All his fans would, in a way, this would validate everything that they have been saying about the deep state or the institutions or the far left, whatever it is that they were saying. In a way, this polarizes us a lot more. The consequences that come from this are just so dire. And the argument that Donald Trump's dangerous rhetoric would reach less people and so less dangerous things would occur in society, I'm just not convinced by that because the type of person that would storm the Capitol is the type of person that would find other ways to just listen to what Donald Trump is saying. They're the type of person that they're not going to see that Donald Trump is off Twitter and say, well, I guess I'm de radicalized now. That's just not how it works. No matter what, these people are going to find other venues. And so I can't help but feel that even if Donald Trump broke the terms of service, the dangers that come from deplatforming this are vastly higher than the dangers from keeping him on. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's I was concerned about this when it happened. Um, you know, I basically wondered what not whether it made sense to remove Donald Trump or whether it was correct, but whether it was wise. And and by that I meant, and I wasn't sure about the answer, and I'm not totally sure about the answer now, I don't think. But what by that what I meant is that, you know, he's just going to go somewhere else, and anybody who's inclined to listen to him is just going to follow him there. And what actually it might end up happening is that the rest of us might not hear what's going on and may not hear what he's saying, which we probably should. Um, you know, and you know, there's also, you know, I have Donald Trump muted, so I didn't see much of his stuff, but I would see people talking about it, you know, and every once in a while I would see, you know, someone would screenshot it or whatever, so I would see it anyway. And you know, I can kind of just be like, oh, this is annoying. But it's a particularly interesting case though because, you know, while he was president, he flagrantly violated the terms of service a lot, and he wasn't booted off because he was president. Because it became a very strange scenario where people had to figure out what do we do here because this is the first time that something like this is happening where, you know, a sitting president is using this platform almost as a replacement for press conferences, you know, and communicating official news and information to the public via this platform. So it turned into a really strange. situation where people had to figure out what do we do here, and they decided, he can't block people because he's the president, and people have a right to see what he's saying, which pissed him off, right? And then even though he was violating the terms of service, it became a thing where we can't really get rid of him because people need to know what he's saying, and he has to be able to say what he wants to say to the American people. And then he didn't get booted off until he was basically gone, until it was over. And what they ended up getting him on, I think, didn't actually violate the terms of service. It seemed to be like a fudge. I'm not totally sure on the details there, but yeah, it just points to how difficult this really is because even though Twitter is not real life, it affects real life in very real ways, right? That sometimes, even in my case, right, there are conversations that I have on Twitter that lead me to write essays that then get published in real, digital media, and then people outside of Twitter can read those. So there's one way in which it spills over into reality, and that's just a small and relatively, inconsequential way. But there are, people get fired, people get jobs, people, like policies change as a result of things that happen on Twitter. So it's not that it doesn't matter what's going on there. It's not that it doesn't have an effect. It really does. And it just puts us in this really strange position where we're not sure how exactly we should approach this thing. It is being used as a public utility, but it is not one in very fundamental ways. And it just becomes very difficult to figure out how do we arbitrate all this? And when it comes to somebody like a sitting president who's a fucking nutbag doing crazy things that, nobody was ready for this, right? Nobody could have anticipated, like, I mean, Barack Obama was on Twitter too. And this didn't happen because he wasn't like certifiable, right? He wasn't using Twitter that way. But here's Trump, and he's basically presenting us with this new problem that we still haven't figured out the best way to address. And I don't know if we can. It's just a really bizarre situation.
Like we double back around to the idea that we haven't matured along with
Mm-hmm.
our level of maturation as a people hasn't kept up with the maturation of the level of technology we have.
Mm-hmm.
Um, one of the I mentioned this on Twitter a few times myself, and one of the things I greatly regret is a platform like Letter.wiki had not taken off to the level as
Mm-hmm.
Twitter has. In a constant criticism I hear of probably my overall favorite podcast, Joe Rogan's podcast, is like a lot of people think he's a quote unquote right wing figure that immediately
Mm-hmm.
disqualifies the person from serious consideration in my view, because it's obvious they don't watch the show.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes I don't think it's necessarily the personality, but it's more like the idea that Joe has these overall 3 to 4 hour conversations, which are fascinating from a variety of people from the political spectrum. It's candy for someone who wants to consume ideas, get different perspectives, and get a piecemeal approach as to how someone can defend their idea. Not piecemeal, I'm sorry, get a complex idea of
Mm-hmm.
how someone can defend their points of view, and like they stand or fall based on their own merits. Like there was that episode in which like Rogan was grilling Candace Owens, and she could not defend her
Mm-hmm.
climate change denialism, and Joe was just taking her apart. He wasn't even trying to do so maliciously. He was just pointing things out.
Right.
Um, Twitter, in my opinion, seems to be more poison in that regard. In that, yeah, I think you're absolutely correct that it's a reflection of ourselves and how we choose to use it,
Mm-hmm.
and it brings out oftentimes our worst features. Free admissions. In some ways, I've allowed it to bring out the more assholic tendencies I have. I'm not proud of that. But then again, you see another platform like Letter.wiki, which allows someone to speak in form of a long form podcast. And what happens is that they write out these long essays.
Mm-hmm.
Again, someone can stand or fall based on the strength of their argumentation, the evidence they bring to the table.
Mm-hmm.
It just didn't take off. Like Twitter is just a source of entertainment. Like I think Neil Postman would argue it's more like television in that regard. So
Yep. Yeah.
with regards to the problems facing us, is part of the problem I think certainly has to be with the technology we use. I mean, what's your perspective? Letter did not take off, but Twitter did. But
Yeah.
Twitter is like taking eating candy. Like letter is not as
Yeah. Yeah.
catchy, but it's more substantial. It's more substantive.
Yeah, I think Letter is like PBS or something, where uh, everyone enjoys that it exists, but nobody watches it. And it's kind of it's that, and the reason why is because of the platforms. Yeah, it's because there's a certain level to which social media in particular, and the internet more generally, probably in most cases, is primarily geared towards entertainment, and Letter Wiki is not entertaining. It's or few people find that entertaining, or fewer people find that entertaining. It's two very long and well thought out sort of essays back and forth uh, between two people on a certain topic. If you're not really interested in the topic, or if you don't feel like reading, there's TLDR. I mean, that's a thing. It's a meme now of like, this is too long. I'm not going to read it. Just give me the cliff notes. Um, and it's not because people don't like to read. It's not because people have short attention spans. I think that's all nonsense. And Joe Rogan's podcast is a great example of how that's not true. People sit through 3.5 hour podcasts all the time because they can be engaging, and it can be a way for people to absorb information, but it just depends on the paradigm. It depends on what people are looking for in these particular things. And a much smaller subset of people are looking for thoughtful exchanges in long form between two people, like LetterWiki, versus very quick, applause lines and dunks and insults and back and forth on Twitter. Uh, there's a wider group of people who are looking for that kind of thing, or who will get something out of it much more quickly. Then LetterWiki requires a little bit of an investment. You got to read this essay, and then you got to read the next one, and then you got to read the next one. So that has more of the function of the old school debates where people would actually talk for hours, and then there would be a rebuttal that would take an hour, and it's a lot to absorb, and it really is about the platforms and what we expect of them. One thing about Neil Postman that people get wrong is that they call him a luddite, or they think he's anti-technology, or something like that, and it's not really that. Like, for example, like, he would hate Sesame Street or something. you know but he didn't hate Sesame Street. He just said, look, it's, if I remember right, it's been a while now, but my recollection is that he said, Sesame Street is great, and people do learn things from watching Sesame Street. I know that's true because I did. um, it's not that people can't learn anything. It's not that it's not an educational show. It's that it has to be, by nature of the medium with which it is being presented, primarily concerned with entertainment. It has to entertain you first, because if you change the channel, you won't learn anything, right? So they can have all the educational content they want, but if you change the channel, you're not watching it. So they have to make sure you stay watching the show, and then they'll give you the education. And that's because they understand the medium. And we don't seem to understand the mediums. We don't understand what the purpose of these platforms is. We don't seem to get that. We have to recognize what it is first, and then we can sort of calibrate our expectations. You know what I mean?
Well, this doubles back around to what you were saying earlier about how this magnifies some of our worst aspects, and like, this is not a technology we really know how to use. Because I mean, I recently got through listening to Neil Postman's book, which, again, thank you. That was a fantastic read.
Yeah, everyone should read that book.
Yeah, I totally agree. And but the section that you're referencing brought up he said something that really resonated with me about like how entertainment can be used as a medium for education, but he thought that was an incorrect way to view things, because you don't need to be entertained to
Mm-hmm.
to absorb knowledge. It's going to require some level of suffering on your part to take in new knowledge. It's like someone training for a sports event. I'm like, you want to get the high that comes from the victory, but you're going to have to hit the weights. You're going to have to increase your cardiovascular performance. It's no different
Mm-hmm.
than exercising your mental muscles. They're analogous in that regard. So if we can't use our technology responsible in that fashion, if we don't
Mm-hmm.
put the effort into, for as you both said earlier, changing our culture So
Hmm.
we take that approach rather than going the dunking entertainment
Right.
public shaming route. Then this is really an indictment on us, and
Right.
it's a wake up call to say, hey, this is the 21st century. This is the way we need to do things now.
Yeah. Getting back to the chainsaw uh, metaphor, you can't use a chainsaw for everything, right? Sometimes you need a hammer. Sometimes you need a power drill. Sometimes you need a pencil and paper. Like, like that's the thing too. You have to recognize what a chainsaw is for and only use it for what it's for, you know? And that's something that we have trouble doing as well. We like, now we want to have iPads in every classroom. Like every student's got to have an iPad. What for? Well, like, what's wrong with a pencil and a pad? Like nothing. It just is like, well, because it's here, we should use it, and because it makes certain things easier, we should use it. But it's also making other things more difficult. We should just recognize what these things are, what these tools are, what they're best suited to, and use them for that purpose, and not use them for every purpose. You know?
Yeah, the combination of entertainment and politics has been one that I've been concerned about recently. Um,
Yeah.
especially from a comedic perspective, comedians who joke a lot about politics in their opening
Mm-hmm.
monologues for SNL, or someone like Trevor Noah actually comes to mind perfectly because I think the problem, well, there are good things that come from the fusion of entertainment and politics. It makes it more accessible. People are more likely to pay attention, and ideas that people normally would not have been exposed to, they get exposed to
Mm-hmm.
by accident, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
But the concern that hits me is that most of these issues, if not all of them, that they talk about, they're very complex and they require a level of nuance that is very
Right.
difficult, if not impossible, to capture in a 2 minute joke.
Mm-hmm.
So the politics come off as really dumbed down. And I think Trevor Noah is a great example of this. There was a video that was made about Trevor Noah and Dave Rubin where they say, uh, it's by a now defunct YouTube channel, but basically it was about how you can talk a lot without saying anything. And
Mm-hmm.
that's effectively what they did. And they would give off these platitudes and these slogans, but they never really said anything substantial past
Mm-hmm.
that. And so Trevor Noah's jokes, let's say he would joke about or make a joke against Republicans or conservatives, and because it's within 2 minutes, he's addressing an issue that is a very dumbed down and inaccurate version of
Mm-hmm.
what it is that he's trying to say. The level of precision and accuracy that I think should be expected when talking about politics is not even close to being found.
Right.
And so, as a big fan of comedy, I really love comedy and I like to imagine a parallel universe where I become a comedian, even though I'm not particularly funny. I really respect comedy a lot. And so, it is also disheartening to see that we live in a world in which political comedians such as Trevor Noah, either the political message gets diluted because it is within the context of a 2 minute joke, or the
Mm-hmm.
comedy itself gets diluted because you're either alienating a large group of people that don't agree with your political opinion,
Right.
or you're also just the punchline gets diluted because of the focus on politics as well. And that's
Yeah.
been my concern with the fusion of entertainment and politics. It's just this dumbed down version of
Mm-hmm.
complex issues that are getting people more rowdy and against the other side, especially within the realm of comedy. Is you holds a
Mm-hmm.
similar concern, I guess, for that specific little subsection of entertainment?
Yeah, I mean, it's comedy. Nuance isn't funny. You know, like if you're hedging everything and sort of couching everything and sort of doubling back and saying, well, not most, but not all. Like you're not being funny because the whole point of the comedy is exaggeration and ridiculousness. It's absurdity. So pointing out absurdity, you're going to have to simplify, right? It's similar with even protest. Like your message has to fit on a poster board so that you can lift it up. You're not going to have this 300 word nuanced statement on your poster board because no one's going to read that, right? It's just like a mass of text. um, you have to simplify, you have to distill it and get to this core thing, which is why I'm not very good at a protest, because like there are very few things that I would be comfortable putting on a poster board that are pithy and concise, like freedom for everyone. Yeah, I could put that, or be kind, shit like that. But like this particular political policy is problematic, but not completely. I understand where they're coming from, but they're mistaken because of XYZ. That's not going to work on a poster board, and
Mhm.
it doesn't work in comedy either. And I think that's fine as long as people know that that's the case, right? And I think that that gets back to what we were just talking about. Trevor Noah is not a politician. Trevor Noah is a comedian and a commentator. If you understand that, then you can get something out of his commentary and his comedy, even though it's politically sort of balanced and focused on politics and commenting on politics and stuff like that. There are plenty of comedians who do a great job with that and make great points and are really insightful. But you have to recognize they're comedians and they're by necessity distilling things and oversimplifying, right? To get at something that's going to make you laugh, hopefully, instead of just preaching to you. Politics is not supposed to be entertaining. And we're supposed to know that. We're supposed to know that it's not supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be work. Kind of like what Bruce was just saying. Like it's the lifting weights and eating healthy part of our responsibility if we want to get in good shape. And that's kind of the way that it's supposed to work. But because of the mediums, because we use television, because we use social media, and because we sort of have this now, after 30 years or so of this sort of paradigm, we have this sort of expectation that politicians are supposed to be fun and charming and entertaining, and politics is supposed to be, you know, political debates are supposed to be like a game that we watch, like football. Like that's how we treat it, that's how we contextualize it, and that's why it is the way that it is. That's why you have 60 seconds to outline your foreign policy. Like that's crazy. These are consequential things that are really difficult, and we should be expecting nuance. We should be expecting things to be boring. We should expect it to be, look, this is just a slog. We're going to have to do our best here. But it's just hard to fight that human instinct when somebody charming shows up and makes it entertaining. Everyone just goes there because that's it's obviously more fun. But
Mhm.
but it's again it's not that it's all our fault and that there's nothing that can be done to make things better on a sort of top down systemic level. It's just that I see so much of it being about our own perception and our own approach to it. And that seems to me to be an easier thing to do. It's an easier task, is for all of us to go, hey, look, we're all complaining about this thing, right? So that means we recognize an issue. Well, individually, each of us can do XYZ right now, and it will change things at least slightly, at least for ourselves. If I go into it going, I'm not going to watch this debate because what's the point? They're not going to tell me anything. It's all, applause lines, and it's basically people tweeting at each other in real life, right? But what I'm going to do is look deeper into the issue and make up my mind that way. And it kind of becomes like the algorithm, right? The algorithm of politics is people want to be entertained, people want applause lines, people want to punch their opponent. So that's what I'm going to do, and that's what is going to resonate with people. But if we change what we want, they're going to change what they give us because they want to give us what we want. You know?
Matt Taibbi writes about that in Hate.Inc. I need to go back and reread it because I listen to the Audible version. Sometimes the material just gets lost in my head when I just listen instead of
Yeah.
read it carefully. But he makes that point. That's what worked to Donald Trump's advantage in the 2016 election.
Right.
He makes the case how cases in the past years have been building up to this moment when we have been focusing on the entertainment superficial aspects of people, ideas, and policies rather than the actual substance. And
Mm-hmm.
this is what it culminated into. So yeah, that's very true.
Yeah. We just have to recognize, what is this thing supposed to be doing for us? And it seems like the answer for almost everything, whether people realize it or not, is it's supposed to entertain me and give me this. But mainly it's supposed to be entertaining. And I don't think people realize that. And because of that, we have all these problems. And then people think that the problem is coming from somewhere else. The problem is really coming from what our expectations are from these things. Social media, yeah, that's entertainment, you know? But then we smuggle all this other stuff into it. Now it's news and now it's politics and now it's social justice. And the entertainment aspect is still king, but we don't notice it. It becomes this sort of ghost in the machine, and it causes all these downstream problems, to mix metaphors.
My resolution is to prescribe Adderall to everyone, and everyone will be interested instantly in everything that is boring. That's my
Oh
solution.
man. Yeah. Well,
But that's a good place to end this podcast, Mr. Eduardo. We always love talking to you, and we love interacting and liking your tweets on Twitter because you're genuinely one of our favorite people on Twitter. There are very few people that I think I can safely say I can genuinely get the vibe, get the idea that they really care about trying to mend these divides in society. I think a lot of people out there come off as very disingenuous, or they claim that they're
mm,
genuine, and they probably are genuine, but they have a harder time actually becoming the person that they wish to see in society. But I think you do a great job out of that. So
oh
where
well.
can people find you?
Well, thank you very much. That means a lot. I'm trying my best, but please do not expect perfection or anything near it, because I'm just like everybody else. I'm just a schmuck. So if you wanna be privy to me being a schmuck, you can check out my website, angeleduardo.com, and I am at strangeledweird on Twitter, and I'm on Instagram and things. So follow me and challenge me and argue with me, and we'll figure it out together. Let's see what happens.
All right, man. Well, this was great. Thanks for joining us, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. And see you around.
Yeah, thank you both very much. It was great talking to you.